In the pre-dawn darkness of September 1st, 1939, a German soldier peered through the morning mist toward the Polish border. His rifle was loaded. His orders were clear. In a few hours, he and millions like him would plunge the world into a war that would consume 60 million lives. But here's what he didn't know, and what the world is still learning. This war wasn't inevitable. It wasn't the natural continuation of some ancient hatred or the unavoidable clash of ideologies. World War II was built, step by step, decision by decision, or rather by the absence of decisions. For 20 years, the world's great powers watched. They waited. They hoped. And with each moment of inaction, with each appeasing gesture, with each failure to draw a line, they constructed the very catastrophe they sought to avoid. They didn't stumble into World War II. They walked into it backward, eyes closed, fingers crossed, praying that the monster they refused to confront would simply go away. It didn't. This is the story of those 20 years. The 2 decades when humanity had a choice, had the power, had every opportunity to stop what was coming, and chose not to. It's the story of how Japan seized an entire Chinese province and the world shrugged. How Italy invaded Ethiopia while the League of Nations wrung its hands. How Hitler swallowed Austria whole and Britain's Prime Minister congratulated himself on preserving peace. Welcome to the Anatomy of Failure. Welcome to the 20 years that built World War II. Versailles and its fatal flaws, 1918 to 1923. November 11th, 1918. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Church bells rang across Europe. In London, strangers embraced in the streets. In Paris, crowds danced until dawn. The Great War, the war to end all wars, was finally over. 4 years of mechanized slaughter had claimed 20 million lives. The empires that had started the conflict lay shattered. Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II had fled to Holland. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was disintegrating. The Ottoman Empire was collapsing. And on battlefields from France to Mesopotamia, exhausted soldiers began the long walk home. But even as Europe celebrated, something poisonous was already taking root. In Germany, a myth was being born, a dangerous lie that would infect an entire generation. The German generals, those same commanders who had thrown millions of men into futile offensives, who had watched their armies crumble under the weight of British, French, and American firepower, now whispered a different story. We weren't defeated, they told anyone who would listen. We were betrayed. The Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back legend. Germany's fighting men hadn't lost on the battlefield, oh no. They'd been betrayed by cowardly politicians, by socialists, by Jews. The army remained undefeated in the field. If only the home front had held firm, victory would have been theirs. It was a complete fabrication. Germany's spring 1918 offensive had failed catastrophically. By autumn, her armies were in full retreat, her allies surrendering, her people starving under the British naval blockade. The armistice saved Germany from invasion and occupation. But lies are more comforting than truth, and this lie would prove catastrophic. Into this wounded world came President Woodrow Wilson of the United States, carrying humanity's last best hope. Wilson was an idealist, a professor who believed in the power of reason and the promise of international cooperation. He had led America into the war reluctantly, only after German submarines began sinking American ships. But now, with victory secured, he would reshape the world order itself. His vision was radical, a League of Nations where disputes would be resolved through negotiation, not warfare. No more secret treaties, no more balance of power politics, no more arms races spiraling into apocalypse. Just civilized nations, sitting around a table, talking through their differences like reasonable adults. It was beautiful. It was noble. And it was doomed from the start. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919 in the Hall of Mirrors where Germany had proclaimed its empire in 1871, was supposed to embody Wilson's vision. Instead, it became a masterclass in creating future conflict. The treaty writers faced an impossible task. Punish Germany enough to satisfy French and British voters who had suffered enormously, but not so harshly that Germany would seek revenge. They failed spectacularly at both. Germany lost 13% of its territory and all its overseas colonies. Its army was restricted to 100,000 men, barely a police force, no tanks, no air force, no submarines, no general staff. The Rhineland, Germany's industrial heartland bordering France, was to be permanently demilitarized. But the real poison came in Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. Germany and its allies bore sole responsibility for starting the war and all its damages. Therefore, Germany would pay, and pay, and pay. The final bill, 132 billion gold marks, about $33 billion in 1921 dollars, roughly $442 billion in today's money. It was a sum calculated not by economic analysis but by political necessity, the maximum amount Allied politicians thought they could extract and still get re-elected. British economist John Maynard Keynes, who attended the negotiations, resigned in protest, predicting that these terms would devastate Germany's economy and sow the seeds of future conflict. He was right. But the Treaty of Versailles did more than punish Germany. It redrew the map of Europe and, in doing so, planted time bombs that would detonate within 20 years. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, that polyglot realm that had ruled Central Europe for centuries, was dismembered. New nations appeared on the map. Austria, reduced to a rump state. Hungary, stripped of 2/3 of its former territory. Czechoslovakia, an entirely new creation combining Czechs and Slovaks with substantial German, Hungarian, and Polish minorities. Yugoslavia, trying to unite Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and others who had centuries of mutual antagonism. Germany's eastern territories became the Polish Corridor, giving the newly recreated Poland access to the Baltic Sea. This left East Prussia as an isolated German enclave, separated from the rest of Germany by Polish territory. The city of Danzig, German-speaking, German-built, German in everything but name, became a free city under League of Nations supervision. Poland itself was patched together from territories taken from Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. Its borders satisfied no one and threatened everyone. And here was the ticking time bomb. These new borders left millions of ethnic Germans scattered across Central Europe. 3 million in the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia. 500,000 in the Polish corridor. Hundreds of thousands more in Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia. These weren't just statistics. They were people who spoke German, thought of themselves as German, and were now ruled by governments they viewed as foreign oppressors. Wilson had championed self-determination, the principle that peoples should choose their own government. But self-determination apparently didn't apply to Germans. This contradiction would haunt Europe. One day, a leader would arise who promised to reunite all German peoples into a single nation. And when that day came, would the Western powers really go to war to stop Germans from uniting with other Germans? It was a question no one wanted to answer in 1919, but by 1938 it would become unavoidable. President Wilson returned to America expecting a hero's welcome. Instead, he found a political ambush. The U.S. Senate, controlled by Republicans suspicious of foreign entanglements, refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. More importantly, they refused to join Wilson's League of Nations. The irony was crushing. America's president had created an international organization to prevent future wars, but America itself wouldn't join. Wilson embarked on a desperate nationwide speaking tour to rally public support. The strain was too much. In September 1919, he suffered a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed for the rest of his presidency. Without American participation, the League of Nations was crippled from birth. It had no army, no way to enforce its decisions. Its power rested entirely on moral authority and the willingness of its members to act collectively against aggression. And the world's strongest industrial power, the nation that had tipped the balance in the Great War, had just walked away. America retreated into isolationism. The Senate passed laws to keep America out of future European conflicts. The Army, which had grown to 4 million men by 1918, was rapidly demobilized. By 1920, it numbered just 200,000. The message was clear. Europe's next war would be Europe's problem. The first brick in the road to World War II had been laid. The international system meant to prevent war had been sabotaged before it even started. The new German government, the Weimar Republic, named after the city where its constitution was written, faced impossible challenges from day one. Germany's economy had been hollowed out by 4 years of total war. Its people were exhausted, traumatized, and angry. And now they had to pay the Allied powers 132 billion marks. Germany couldn't pay. It simply couldn't. The terms were economically impossible. But when Germany defaulted on coal deliveries to France in January 1923, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, to seize payment by force. The German government responded with passive resistance. Workers went on strike rather than cooperate with the occupation. It was a gesture of defiance, and it destroyed Germany's economy. To support the striking workers, the government simply printed money, even more money. The printing presses ran day and night, churning out bills in ever larger denominations. What followed was hyperinflation, on a scale difficult to comprehend. In January 1923, $1 bought 17,000 marks. By November, $1 bought 4.2 trillion marks. Prices doubled every few days. Workers demanded to be paid twice a day so they could rush out and buy food before their wages became worthless. People carried money in wheelbarrows. A loaf of bread cost billions. Life savings evaporated overnight. An entire generation of middle-class Germans, the people who had done everything right, who had saved prudently, who had believed in order and stability, watched their life's work turn to ash. A 1,000-mark government bond purchased in 1914, worth a year's wages, could now buy a single postage stamp. This wasn't just an economic crisis. It was a psychological catastrophe that destroyed faith in democracy, in the established order, in the very idea that playing by the rules led to security. And in that fertile soil of desperation and rage, extremism took root. The Weimar Republic survived barely after the government finally stabilized the currency in late 1923. But the damage was done. A nation had been traumatized. And traumatized people, desperate people, are willing to listen to anyone who promises simple solutions to complex problems, anyone who identifies clear enemies to blame, anyone who offers the restoration of pride and strength. That someone was waiting in the wings. His name was Adolf Hitler, and he had been watching Germany's humiliation with growing fury and crystallizing purpose. The Rise of the Dictators, 1922 to 1933. The first domino fell not in Germany, but in Italy, and it fell almost by accident, which should have terrified everyone paying attention. It proved how fragile democracy could be when faced with determined extremism and government paralysis. Italy had fought on the Allied side in World War I, suffering enormous casualties for meager territorial gains. The economy was shattered. Unemployment soared. Strikes paralyzed cities. In the countryside, peasants seized land from aristocratic estates. The democratic government seemed powerless to restore order. Enter Benito Mussolini, former socialist, war veteran, journalist turned political rabble-rouser. In 1919, he formed the Fasci di Combattimento, the fascist movement, combining rabid nationalism with promises to restore order through strongman rule. His black shirts, squadristi and black uniforms beat up socialists and broke strikes. To business owners and middle-class Italians terrified by visions of Bolshevik revolution, the fascists looked like saviors. In October 1922, with Italy paralyzed by yet another general strike, Mussolini made his move. He ordered his followers to march on Rome and seize power. It was an audacious bluff. The Italian army could have crushed the fascist columns easily. But King Victor Emmanuel III lost his nerve. Fearing civil war, he invited Mussolini to form a government instead. Il Duce, the leader, had taken power. Within 3 years, he had dismantled Italian democracy, banned opposition parties, muzzled the press, and established a one-party state. And the world watched with disturbing fascination, not horror. Mussolini made the trains run on time, people said. He eliminated the mafia. He built roads and drained swamps. Italy had order again. Democracy was messy, chaotic, weak. Fascism got things done. This was the message that echoed across Europe. And in Germany, a failed artist and war veteran named Adolf Hitler was taking careful notes. Adolf Hitler should have died in obscurity. Born in Austria in 1889, he dreamed of becoming an artist but was rejected by Vienna's Academy of Fine Arts. When World War I erupted, he found purpose. He enlisted in the German army and served as a message runner on the Western Front. He was brave, earning the Iron Cross, but remained a corporal. His fellow soldiers found him odd, intense, unable to form normal friendships. The war's end devastated him. Germany's surrender felt like personal betrayal. Recovering from a British gas attack in a military hospital when the armistice was signed, he later claimed the news made him weep uncontrollably. In those tears lay the seeds of a political movement that would consume the world. In 1919, still in the army, Hitler was assigned to spy on extremist political groups in Munich. He attended a meeting of the tiny German Workers' Party and found his calling. Here were people who shared his rage at Germany's defeat, at the Treaty of Versailles, at the Weimar Republic, at communists, at Jews. Hitler discovered he possessed an extraordinary gift. He could channel that rage into speeches that transfixed audiences. Within months, he had seized control of the party, renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazis for short, and begun building it into a movement. The Nazis combined nationalism with socialist-sounding promises to workers, wrapped in pseudo-scientific racial theories that blamed Germany's problems on Jewish conspiracies. It was incoherent as ideology, but powerful as propaganda. Hitler was a nobody leading a fringe movement. But then came the hyperinflation crisis of 1923. With Germany seemingly on the verge of collapse, Hitler decided to seize power through force, just as Mussolini had done in Italy the previous year. On November 8, 1923, Hitler and his stormtroopers burst into a Munich beer hall where Bavarian leaders were meeting. Firing a pistol into the ceiling, Hitler declared a national revolution. The next day, he led 2,000 followers in a march through Munich, intending to seize the Bavarian War Ministry. The beer hall putsch, as it became known, was a fiasco. Police opened fire. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen died. Hitler fled, was captured 2 days later, and stood trial for treason. He should have disappeared into prison obscurity. Instead, he turned his trial into political theater, using it as a platform to spread his message. The sympathetic judges gave him just 5 years, and he served less than 9 months in comfortable conditions at Landsberg prison. In prison, Hitler wrote. Or rather, he dictated to his loyal follower Rudolf Hess. The result was Mein Kampf, My Struggle, a rambling, barely coherent screed that laid out his worldview with chilling clarity. Germany needed living space, Lebensraum, in the East. The Aryan race must dominate inferior peoples. Jews were parasites destroying German racial purity and must be eliminated from German life. Democracy was a Jewish invention designed to weaken strong nations. Germany's future required authoritarian leadership, rearmament, territorial expansion, and racial purification. It was all there. The Blueprint for World War II and the Holocaust, published in 1925, available for anyone to read. The book sold modestly at first. Most people found it unreadable. But no one could claim later that Hitler had hidden his intentions. He told the world exactly what he planned to do. The world simply chose not to believe him. But here's the thing. For several years, it looked like none of this mattered. Hitler's putsch had failed. Mussolini seemed like a local problem, contained in Italy. The League of Nations was settling minor disputes. The American economy was booming. Maybe, just maybe, the world had learned its lesson. In 1924, the Allies revised Germany's reparations payments through the Dawes Plan, making them manageable. American loans poured into Germany, fueling an economic recovery. The Weimar Republic stabilized. Germans stopped carrying money in wheelbarrows. Unemployment fell. The middle class rebuilt its savings. Democracy appeared to be working. Support for extremist parties, both the Nazis on the right and the communists on the left, plummeted. In the 1928 elections, the Nazis won just 2.6% of the vote. Hitler seemed like a relic, a failed agitator whose moment had passed. The German people had rejected extremism and embraced democratic stability. In France and Britain, war-weary populations wanted to believe the worst was over. The League of Nations facilitated the Locarno Treaties in 1925, where Germany, France, and Belgium mutually guaranteed their borders. Germany was admitted to the League of Nations in 1926. The Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928 saw 62 nations renounce war as an instrument of national policy. Peace, it seemed, had finally arrived. But this prosperity rested on a foundation of sand: American loans and American consumption. And in America, something dangerous was building. Stock prices climbed higher and higher, disconnected from actual corporate earnings. Investors bought on margin, borrowing money to buy stocks they couldn't afford, betting prices would keep rising forever. Banks made increasingly reckless loans. The Roaring Twenties roared ever louder, drowning out the occasional voice warning that this couldn't last. It couldn't. And when it ended, it would end catastrophically, taking the fragile peace with it. October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday. The New York Stock Exchange collapsed. Panic selling. Stocks that had seemed solid investments yesterday became worthless paper today. Fortunes evaporated in hours. Banks that had loaned money to investors demanding repayment found there was no money to collect. Within weeks, banks began failing. Depositors lost their savings. Credit dried up. Businesses couldn't get loans. The Great Depression had begun. Within a year, the economic contagion spread globally. American loans that had rebuilt Europe were suddenly called in. Banks collapsed across Germany, Austria, and Central Europe. International trade plummeted as nations raised tariffs to protect domestic industries, creating a death spiral of economic contraction. By 1932, the worldwide economy had contracted by 15%. Industrial production in Germany fell by 40%. Unemployment in America hit 25%, 13 million people out of work. In Germany, it reached 6 million, 40% of the workforce. In Britain, unemployment hit 22%. Even the Soviet Union, theoretically insulated by its communist command economy, saw millions starve. This wasn't just an economic crisis. It was a civilizational crisis that destroyed faith in the entire capitalist democratic system. People who had played by the rules, who had worked hard, who had saved responsibly, now stood in breadlines. They watched their children go hungry. They lost their homes. And when they looked to their democratic governments for help, they saw paralysis and incompetence. In America, President Herbert Hoover insisted the economy would self-correct. The federal government did almost nothing for 3 years while the crisis deepened. In Britain, the Labour government split over whether to cut unemployment benefits, ultimately resigning in failure. In Germany, the government oscillated between austerity measures that deepened the depression and expensive welfare programs it couldn't afford. Democracy, it seemed, had no answer to the Great Depression. But the extremists did. They had simple explanations for complex problems. They had enemies to blame. They promised action, strength, purpose. In Germany, unemployment offices became recruiting stations for the Nazis and communists. Both offered free soup kitchens. Both organized rallies that gave desperate people a sense of belonging. Both promised revolutionary change. The political center was collapsing, and into the void rushed the extremes. The Great Depression was Hitler's salvation. The Nazi Party, a marginal joke with 2.6% support in 1928, suddenly offered something millions of desperate Germans wanted to hear. It's not your fault. You didn't fail. You were betrayed. By the Versailles Treaty, by the Weimar politicians, by the international Jewish conspiracy. Nazi propaganda was crude, but effective. Hitler blamed Germany's problems on the November criminals who had signed the armistice in 1918. On the Weimar Republic's weak democratic leaders. On communist agitators trying to turn Germany into a Soviet puppet, on Jewish financiers orchestrating Germany's economic collapse, and he promised a simple solution. Restore German strength through authoritarian leadership. Tear up Versailles. Rearm, make Germany great again. The Nazi message resonated. In the September 1930 elections, the Nazis won 18.3% of the vote, becoming the second largest party in the Reichstag. By July 1932, they were the largest party with 37.3%. Hitler had done exactly what he promised after the failed beer hall putsch. He would come to power legally, using democracy to destroy democracy. Germany's traditional conservatives made a fatal calculation. Hitler was crude, vulgar, clearly unbalanced. But maybe they could use him. Use his popular support, his ability to mobilize the masses, but control him from within. They would make him chancellor, but surround him with responsible conservatives who would restrain his extremism. They could manage Hitler. On January 30, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg, Germany's aged war hero, a monarchist who despised Hitler personally, appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Conservative elites convinced themselves they had caged a useful attack dog. They hadn't. They had opened the door for a wolf who would devour them all. Within weeks, Hitler had begun dismantling German democracy. A fire destroyed the Reichstag building on February 27th. Hitler blamed communist terrorists and demanded emergency powers to restore order. The Reichstag fire decree suspended civil liberties indefinitely. Then came the Enabling Act of March 1933, which allowed Hitler to make laws without the Reichstag's approval. Democracy had voted itself out of existence. By July 1933, all political parties except the Nazis were banned. Trade unions were dissolved. The free press was strangled. The civil service was purged of Jews and political opponents. The SA stormtroopers, now numbering 3 million, terrorized anyone who resisted. Opposition leaders were arrested and sent to a new kind of detention facility, concentration camps. The transformation took less than 6 months. Germany, sophisticated, educated, culturally advanced Germany, had become a one-party totalitarian state, and the world watched and did nothing. Why? Because Hitler, at least initially, seemed to be solving Germany's problems. Unemployment plummeted as the government launched massive public works projects. The Autobahn highway system, ambitious from the start, would eventually stretch 5,000 miles. Stadiums, public buildings, and infrastructure projects put millions back to work. The economy recovered. Order was restored. Yes, Jews were being persecuted, but surely that would moderate once Hitler consolidated power. Right? Wrong. But by the time the world realized its error, Hitler had already begun the rearmament that would make him unstoppable. The pattern of appeasement begins, 1931 to 1936. While the world fixated on Europe's economic collapse, the first act of unpunished aggression was already unfolding on the other side of the globe. And this failure, this moment when the international community revealed its complete inability to stop a determined aggressor, set the template for everything that followed. Japan in the early 1930s was a nation of contradictions. Nominally a constitutional monarchy with a parliament, real power increasingly lay with ultra-nationalist military officers who viewed their emperor as a living god and their nation as destined to rule Asia. The population was exploding, 70 million people on a volcanic archipelago with almost no natural resources. Japan's industrialization demanded coal, iron, oil, and rubber. It had none of these. The solution to Japan's militarists was obvious: empire. Specifically, Manchuria, the northeastern region of China, rich in coal and minerals, sparsely populated, poorly defended. Japan already had troops stationed there, protecting the South Manchuria Railway Company. On September 18, 1931, Japanese officers staged a minor explosion on the railway line near Mukden and blamed Chinese saboteurs. It was a transparent false flag operation, but it gave the Japanese military the excuse they wanted. Without consulting their own government in Tokyo, local commanders ordered a full-scale invasion. Within months, they had overrun all of Manchuria, an area larger than France and Germany combined. This was the League of Nations moment, its reason for existence. An unprovoked act of aggression against a fellow League member. Here was the test of whether the international system created after World War I could actually prevent future wars. China appealed to the League. The League deliberated, formed a commission, investigated, debated, and months later, in February 1933, issued a report condemning Japan's actions and refusing to recognize the puppet state of Manchukuo that Japan had established. Japan's response was to walk out of the League of Nations. And that was it. No sanctions, no military response. no consequences whatsoever. The League's member states, Britain, France, Italy, the United States, wait, the US wasn't even a member, all decided that Manchuria was too far away, too unimportant, to risk confrontation with Japan. The first test of collective security had revealed a devastating truth. There was no collective security. The lesson reverberated across the world. Aggression works. If you're strong enough and determined enough, you can seize what you want, and the so-called international community will condemn you in the most forceful possible terms, and then do absolutely nothing. In Tokyo, the military officers who had orchestrated the invasion were emboldened. In Rome, Mussolini took note. In Berlin, Hitler, still consolidating his grip on Germany, watched and learned. But why? Why didn't the great powers stop Japan? The answer lies in the economic catastrophe still gripping the world in 1931. Britain and France, the League's only members with substantial military power, were consumed by their domestic economic crises. Britain had been forced off the gold standard in 1931. France was protecting its empire in North Africa and Southeast Asia. The idea of sending troops to Manchuria thousands of miles away to defend China's territorial integrity was political suicide. And America, the one nation that might have challenged Japan in the Pacific? America had retreated into isolationism after rejecting the League of Nations. President Herbert Hoover, facing economic collapse at home, had no appetite for foreign adventures. The United States issued statements of disapproval and recognized nothing. The Stimson Doctrine, named after Secretary of State Henry Stimson, announced that America would not recognize any territory acquired by force. Japan ignored it. Why wouldn't they? Words without force are just noise. The Great Depression didn't just devastate economies. It devastated political will. When your people are hungry, when unemployment is catastrophic, when banks are failing and businesses closing, sending your army to some distant land over abstract principles of international law is impossible to justify. The democracies retreated inward, focused on survival. And in that absence of will, aggressors found opportunity. Hitler understood this perfectly. Upon taking power in January 1933, he immediately began violating the Treaty of Versailles, but carefully, secretly, testing how much he could get away with. The treaty limited Germany's army to 100,000 men and forbade tanks, military aircraft, and submarines. Hitler ordered all three developed in secret. The Reichswehr, Germany's small professional army, became the training cadre for a much larger force. Glider clubs, legal under Versailles, trained future Luftwaffe pilots. Tank designs were tested in secret partnership with the Soviet Union. German engineers designed submarines that were technically built for export but could be rapidly repurposed for Germany's own use. But Hitler's true genius lay in rearmament's political cover. He disguised militarization as job creation. The National Labor Service put unemployed men into work camps where they built roads, drained swamps, and, incidentally, received military-style discipline and training. Aircraft factories nominally producing civilian planes employed thousands while developing military designs. By 1935, unemployment had fallen from 6 million to 2 million. Hitler was a savior, restoring German prosperity and pride. In October 1933, Hitler withdrew Germany from the League of Nations and the Geneva Disarmament Conference. Why should Germany disarm when France refused to reduce its own military? It was a fair point, actually, and it resonated with Germans still bitter about Versailles. The world protested weakly. Hitler shrugged and continued rearming. Then in January 1935, the Saar region, separated from Germany under Versailles, held a referendum on its future. Over 90% voted to return to Germany. Hitler proclaimed this a vindication of his policies. The Treaty of Versailles was slowly being dismantled, one piece at a time, and the Western powers were letting it happen. For a brief moment in spring 1935, it seemed like Britain, France, and Italy might unite against Hitler's growing threat. In April, they met at Stresa in Italy and issued a joint declaration condemning Germany's rearmament and affirming their commitment to Austrian independence. This Stresa Front represented the last realistic chance to contain Hitler before he became too strong to stop. It fell apart within months. Why? Because Mussolini had his own imperial ambitions. and Britain and France were unwilling to sacrifice their strategic interests to maintain the anti-Hitler alliance. The Ethiopian crisis was about to demonstrate just how completely the League of Nations and the system of collective security had failed. But first, Hitler made his boldest move yet. On March 9, 1935, Germany announced the existence of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. Hermann Göring, Hitler's corpulent second-in-command and a World War I flying ace, became its commander. Germany, Hitler announced, already had 2,500 aircraft, more than Britain or France. It was a flagrant violation of Versailles, and Hitler followed it up a week later by announcing the reintroduction of military conscription. The 100,000-man army would triple to 300,000 within a year. This was the moment for Britain and France to say enough, to demand Germany comply with the treaty, to threaten sanctions or military action, to show that flagrant treaty violations would not be tolerated. Instead, Britain negotiated a naval agreement with Germany. In June 1935, without consulting France, Britain signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, allowing Germany to build a navy up to 35% the size of the Royal Navies. Britain rationalized this as practical. Germany was going to rearm anyway, so at least this kept its naval build-up within manageable limits. But the message it sent was catastrophic. Britain had just unilaterally overturned part of the Treaty of Versailles. If Britain wasn't going to enforce the treaty, why should anyone? Hitler had gambled that the Western democracies lacked the will to stop him. He was right, and now he knew it. The pattern was set. Hitler would make a move that violated international agreements. Britain and France would protest. Hitler would offer some justification. Germans needed to defend themselves, or he was only taking back what was rightfully German. And after stern words, Britain and France would accept the fait accompli. Each success emboldened Hitler for the next larger gamble, but it also emboldened another dictator who had been watching carefully, Benito Mussolini. If Germany could rearm with impunity, what could Italy do? Ethiopia and the League's death, 1935 to 1936. Il Duce had grand dreams. He would restore the Roman Empire, with Italy dominating the Mediterranean and North Africa. He already controlled Libya, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland. But he wanted more. He wanted revenge for Italy's humiliating defeat at Ottawa in 1896, when Ethiopian warriors had crushed an Italian invasion, the only time in the colonial era when a European army was decisively defeated by an African force. Mussolini's target was Ethiopia, then called Abyssinia, one of only two independent nations in Africa. It was ruled by Emperor Haile Selassie, a modernizing monarch who had brought Ethiopia into the League of Nations in 1923. This membership would prove meaningless. In December 1934, Italian and Ethiopian forces clashed at the Wal Wal Oasis in the Ogaden region, disputed territory between Ethiopia and Italian Somaliland. Mussolini used this minor incident as a pretext, demanding reparations and territory. When Ethiopia refused and appealed to the League of Nations, Mussolini began massing troops in Eritrea and Somaliland. This was it, the League's second major test. But unlike Manchuria, distant, complicated, involving Japan's interests in China, this was clear-cut. An Italian invasion of Ethiopia would be pure imperialism, a large power conquering a small one, a League member attacking another League member. If the League couldn't stop this, what was it for? On October 3, 1935, Italian forces invaded Ethiopia from both north and south. It wasn't even a fair fight. Italy deployed 400,000 troops, supported by tanks, artillery, and bomber aircraft. Ethiopia fielded about 500,000 men, but most were irregularly armed tribesmen with rifles from the 19th century. Some Ethiopian warriors still carried spears and shields. But the Ethiopians fought with desperate courage. In the mountainous terrain, Italian columns were ambushed and mauled. For months, the war seemed to bog down. Then Mussolini authorized chemical warfare. Sulfur mustard gas bombs dropped from aircraft onto Ethiopian positions and villages. This was explicitly outlawed by the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which Italy had signed. Italian forces sprayed poison gas on everything: troop concentrations, supply caravans, hospitals, civilians. One Italian general later estimated that poison gas was used in practically every bombing operation. The estimates of Ethiopian deaths from gas attacks run to tens of thousands. Emperor Haile Selassie personally led his imperial guard into battle, rallying his troops even as Italian artillery and aircraft tore through their ranks. He appealed to the League of Nations with increasing desperation. "I ask the great powers, who have promised to guarantee the collective security of small states, what measures do they intend to take?" he demanded in October 1935. The League's response was to form committees, issue statements, impose sanctions. Sort of. In November 1935, the League's member states agreed to limited economic sanctions on Italy, an embargo on arms sales, on certain metals, on financial loans. But oil, the one commodity that might have crippled Italy's war machine, was not sanctioned. Why? Because Britain and France feared that cutting off Italy's oil might push Mussolini into Hitler's arms. They were trying to maintain the Stresa Front, that anti-German alliance, even as Mussolini was demonstrating exactly the kind of aggression the Stresa Front was supposedly meant to deter. The logical absurdity was staggering. Britain and France wouldn't punish Italy for invading Ethiopia because they needed Italy to help contain Germany. But if they weren't willing to stop aggression against Ethiopia, what made them think they would stop German aggression later? And why would Mussolini remain allies with nations that had, weakly, sanctioned him when Hitler was offering friendship with no conditions? Moreover, Britain and France controlled the Suez Canal, the shipping route through which Italy was supplying its invasion force. They could have closed it and strangled the Italian invasion logistically. They didn't. Instead, they engaged in secret diplomacy. In December 1935, British Foreign Secretary Samuel Hoare and French Premier Pierre Laval crafted the Hoare-Laval Pact, a secret agreement that would give Mussolini 2/3 of Ethiopia in exchange for ending the war. When news of this cynical deal leaked, public outrage forced both politicians to resign. But the message was clear. Britain and France cared more about appeasing Italy than about defending the principle of collective security. By May 1936, Italian forces had captured Addis Ababa, Ethiopia's capital. Emperor Haile Selassie fled into exile. On June 30, 1936, he addressed the League of Nations in Geneva in person. It's one of the most extraordinary speeches in diplomatic history, a prophet warning a doomed civilization that refused to listen. "I assert that the problem submitted to the Assembly today is a much wider one than merely a question of a settlement in the matter of Italian aggression," Haile Selassie declared. "It is collective security. It is the very existence of the League of Nations. It is the confidence that each state is to place in international treaties." His voice, speaking through an interpreter, was calm but carried devastating moral weight. "Apart from the kingdom of the Lord, there is not on this earth any nation that is superior to any other. Should it happen that a strong government finds it may with impunity destroy a weak people, then the hour strikes for that weak people to appeal to the League of Nations to give its judgment in all freedom." As he spoke, Italian journalists in the gallery jeered and whistled, trying to shout him down. Haile Selassie paused, waiting for order. When he resumed, his conclusion was prophetic. "It is us today. It will be you tomorrow." The League voted to recognize Italy's conquest of Ethiopia. Collective security was dead. The League of Nations had revealed itself as nothing more than a debating club, impotent in the face of determined aggression. Haile Selassie's warning, "It is us today, it will be you tomorrow," would echo through the coming catastrophe. The Italian conquest of Ethiopia demonstrated two catastrophic failures that made World War II inevitable. First, the League of Nations was impotent. Despite Ethiopia's membership, despite Italy's use of chemical weapons, despite clear violations of international law, the League could not stop a medium-sized power from conquering a weaker neighbor. If it couldn't stop Italy, how could it stop Germany or Japan? Second, and more damaging, Britain and France no longer had the stomach for a fight. Their response to Italian aggression was weak sanctions, secret deals, and diplomatic excuses. They chose appeasement over confrontation. They had sent a clear message to every dictator watching: we will not fight to uphold international law. Hitler and Japan's militarists absorbed this lesson. The democracies were weak, divided, afraid. They could be pushed. And if they wouldn't fight over Ethiopia, a clear-cut case of aggression, why would they fight over German claims to the Rhineland, or Austria, or Czechoslovakia? Each act of unpunished aggression emboldened the next. Manchuria showed aggression could succeed. Ethiopia proved the League of Nations was worthless. Now came the test. Would the democracies defend even their own treaty-guaranteed zones of security? The Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno treaties had declared the Rhineland, Germany's western industrial heartland bordering France, permanently demilitarized. No German troops, no fortifications. This was meant to give France security. If Germany ever mobilized for war, France would have time to detect it and respond before German forces could mass at the border. On March 7, 1936, Hitler sent 3,000 German soldiers across the bridges into the Rhineland. It was a colossal gamble. Germany was still militarily weak. The French army alone numbered nearly 900,000 men and could have crushed this token force. German generals begged Hitler to reconsider, warning that if France responded, Germany would face certain defeat. Hitler ordered the troops forward anyway. He believed, correctly, that France wouldn't fight. His soldiers had orders to retreat immediately if they encountered French resistance. But Hitler had read the political situation perfectly. France was in political crisis between governments. Britain was focused on appeasing Mussolini. Neither country had the will for confrontation. The German troops marched in. France mobilized and did nothing. Britain's response? Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden said that Hitler had merely sent troops into his own back garden. After all, the Rhineland was German territory. Wasn't Hitler just asserting sovereignty over his own land? But this argument missed the point entirely. The Rhineland's demilitarization wasn't about sovereignty. It was about security. And now Hitler could begin building fortifications, the Siegfried Line, along the French border. France's strategic advantage, the ability to strike at Germany's industrial heart, was gone. More importantly, Hitler's gamble had succeeded. He had violated a treaty. The democracies had done nothing. The pattern was now clear. Make aggressive moves one at a time, wait for the inevitable protests, offer some justification, and watch as the democracies accept the new reality rather than fight. Hitler later admitted that the Rhineland remilitarization was the most nerve-wracking moment of his life. If the French had then marched into the Rhineland, we would have had to withdraw with our tails between our legs, he told his generals. But France hadn't marched, and that revealed everything Hitler needed to know. The democracies would not fight until forced to. Spain's Civil War, 1936 to 1939. While Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland and Mussolini consolidated his Ethiopian empire, another crisis was brewing that would become the dress rehearsal for World War II. Spain, on the western edge of Europe, was about to tear itself apart. And in that civil war, all the great powers would test their weapons, tactics, and resolve, or lack thereof. Spain in the 1930s was a powder keg. Centuries of feudalism, regional separatism, and conflict between church and state had never been resolved. In 1931, after King Alfonso XIII went into exile, Spain became a republic. The Second Spanish Republic promised reform, land redistribution, secular education, regional autonomy, workers' rights. But reforms triggered backlash from conservatives, the Catholic Church, military officers, and landowners who saw their traditional powers threatened. In February 1936, left-wing parties united in a Popular Front coalition and narrowly won national elections. The victory triggered a wave of strikes, land seizures, and church burnings. The right feared a communist revolution was imminent. Within the military, conservative officers began plotting a coup. On July 17, 1936, military garrisons in Spanish Morocco rebelled. The next day, garrisons across mainland Spain joined the uprising. The rebels expected a quick victory. Previous military coups had succeeded in days. But this time, loyalist forces in Madrid and Barcelona, armed and supported by workers' militias, crushed the rebellions in those cities. Spain split in two. The nationalists, led by General Francisco Franco, controlled much of northern and western Spain plus Spanish Morocco. The Republicans held most of the east and south, including Madrid, Barcelona, and Spain's industrial regions. Both sides began recruiting armies. Both sides committed atrocities, and both sides looked abroad for support. Franco had a problem. His best troops, the Spanish Army of Africa, hardened veterans of colonial wars in Morocco, were stuck in North Africa. The Republic controlled the Spanish Navy and was blockading the Strait of Gibraltar. Franco couldn't get his army to mainland Spain. He sent desperate telegrams to Hitler and Mussolini, pleading for transport aircraft. Hitler, at a Bayreuth opera festival when Franco's message arrived, made a snap decision: help the nationalists. Within days, transport planes from the Luftwaffe's fledgling air force were flying Moroccan troops to Spain. It was the first airlift of troops in military history. 1,500 men flew across the strait in August 1936. Why did Hitler help Franco? Spain itself wasn't strategically crucial to Germany, but Hitler saw an opportunity to test his new military equipment in combat conditions. The Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and German tactics had never been battle-tested. Spain would be the laboratory. Mussolini needed no convincing. He saw Franco's rebellion as part of the broader fascist crusade against communism and democracy. And Italy had the transport capacity to make a real difference. Over the course of the war, Mussolini sent 50,000 Italian volunteers to Spain. They were actually regular army soldiers, plus 700 aircraft, 150 tanks, and enormous quantities of weapons and ammunition. By early 1937, the Condor Legion had arrived in Spain. 12,000 German military personnel operating the latest Luftwaffe fighters and bombers. German tank crews brought Panzer I's and IIs to test them in combat. German artillery officers trained nationalist gunners. Spain became the Wehrmacht's training ground for mobile warfare tactics they would later perfect as blitzkrieg. Stalin watched Hitler and Mussolini aid the nationalists and faced a dilemma. The Spanish Republic was democratic, not communist, but it was left-wing, and the Spanish Communist Party was part of the governing coalition. If Franco won, fascism would control another country bordering France, encircling the democracies. More importantly, a Republican defeat would demonstrate that fascism could defeat democracy when the democracies refused to fight. Stalin didn't want to provoke Hitler into war. The Soviet Union wasn't ready. But he couldn't let fascism win unchallenged. So he sent help, but not enough help to actually win. About 700 Soviet military advisors deployed to Spain, along with tanks, aircraft, and weapons. Soviet officers controlled much of the Republican military command. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, hunted anarchists and anti-Stalin communists within Republican ranks with almost as much enthusiasm as they fought nationalists. But Stalin's support was always calculated, limited, designed to keep Spain in the fight but not to ensure victory. He was using Spain to tie down German and Italian forces, to test Soviet equipment, and to advance communist influence within left-wing movements worldwide. The Spanish Republic's survival was secondary to Stalin's strategic interests. And what did Britain and France do? They declared non-intervention. In August 1936, Britain and France organized a non-intervention committee, which theoretically committed all European powers to stay out of Spain's civil war. 27 nations signed on, including Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union. It was a cynical joke. Germany and Italy poured weapons and troops into Spain while serving on a committee supposedly preventing intervention. When this became obvious, Britain and France kept pretending the agreement meant something. They enforced a naval blockade preventing arms from reaching the Republic but somehow couldn't stop German and Italian ships from supplying the nationalists. Why? Because Britain's conservative government under Stanley Baldwin, and later Neville Chamberlain, feared that supporting the Republic would provoke Hitler and Mussolini, help spread communism. Soviet support for the Republic terrified British conservatives, trigger a general European war for which Britain wasn't ready. France's left-wing Popular Front government under Léon Blum desperately wanted to help the Republic, but France couldn't act alone against German and Italian intervention. When Britain refused to support the Republic, France had no choice but to go along with non-intervention. The result was that the legal, democratically elected Spanish government couldn't purchase weapons from democracies, while the fascist rebels received unlimited support from the fascist powers. The democracies had hamstrung themselves with high-minded neutrality, while the dictatorships ignored rules they had pretended to accept. Into this vacuum came the volunteers. About 35,000 men and women from 50 countries, mostly communists and socialists but also liberals and anarchists, journeyed to Spain to fight fascism. They formed the international brigades, the Lincoln Battalion, Americans, the British Battalion, the Dabrowski Battalion, Poles, the Garibaldi Battalion, Italians, and many others. They were students, writers, workers, intellectuals, people like George Orwell, Ernest Hemingway, and W.H. Auden, who saw Spain as the place where fascism had to be stopped. If we let Franco win, they argued, Hitler and Mussolini will know democracy won't fight. Spain is where we draw the line. But they were fighting with outdated weapons, inadequate training, and catastrophic logistics. The brigade suffered 50 to 60% casualties. They fought with extraordinary courage, holding the line at the Battle of Jarama, halting the nationalist offensive at Guadalajara, defending Madrid through years of siege. But courage couldn't overcome the material superiority Franco enjoyed with full German and Italian support. The international brigades represented something important, proof that ordinary people understood what their governments refused to acknowledge. Fascism had to be confronted. Appeasement wouldn't work. But governments in London and Paris, terrified of war, convinced themselves that neutrality would contain the conflict. They were catastrophically wrong. On April 26, 1937, the Luftwaffe's Condor Legion, supported by Italian aircraft, conducted an experiment. The Basque town of Guernica had no military value. It was a market town behind Republican lines in northern Spain. But German airmen wanted to test a new theory. Could aerial bombing terrorize civilians into submission? For 3 hours, German bombers attacked Guernica in waves. First came high-explosive bombs to demolish buildings, then incendiary bombs to start fires, then machine gun strafing of civilians fleeing the fires. About 1,600 people died, 25% of the town's population. The town center was obliterated. The world was horrified. Pablo Picasso created his masterpiece Guernica to immortalize the atrocity. But the horror revealed something Germany was learning. Strategic bombing of civilians was militarily effective. It created panic, refugee flows that clogged roads, and psychological devastation. Germany would apply these lessons in Poland, Rotterdam, and London. The bombing also demonstrated that Hitler had no qualms about killing civilians to achieve military objectives, and that the democracies would protest but take no action. Guernica was a preview of World War II's unrestricted warfare against civilian populations. The world got a glimpse of what was coming and looked away. Through 1937 and 1938, Franco's forces steadily ground down Republican resistance. German and Italian aid, especially air power, proved decisive. The Nationalist Army, though initially smaller, was better trained, better equipped, and better led. Franco adopted a strategy of steady pressure, exhausting Republican resources while building up his own. The Republic fought desperately. In July 1938, Republicans launched a major offensive across the Ebro River, briefly seizing the initiative. The Battle of the Ebro lasted 4 months and became the war's bloodiest engagement, but German aircraft and artillery eventually forced a Republican retreat. After the Ebro, the Republic was finished militarily. In March 1939, Madrid finally fell. Franco declared victory on April 1st. The Spanish Civil War had killed about 500,000 people. Another 450,000 fled into exile. Franco established a fascist dictatorship that would last until his death in 1975. Lessons learned, lessons ignored. The Spanish Civil War was World War II's prologue, and everyone drew lessons from it. Hitler learned that the Luftwaffe's dive bombers and fighters were effective. Blitzkrieg tactics, fast-moving armored columns supported by air power, worked. Britain and France would not fight to stop fascist expansion. Stalin's Soviet Union could be engaged in a proxy war. Mussolini learned that. Italy's military was less capable than he'd believed. Italian forces performed poorly in several battles. But the democracies were so weak-willed that Italy's military inadequacies didn't matter. Stalin learned that Britain and France couldn't be trusted to confront fascism. The democracies would sacrifice left-wing governments to avoid war. Soviet purges, Stalin had executed much of his officer corps in 1937–38, might have left his military weaker than he'd thought. Britain and France learned nothing. Or rather, they learned the wrong lesson. They convinced themselves that non-intervention had prevented a wider European war. They pat themselves on the back for their wise restraint. They ignored the obvious. Their refusal to confront fascism in Spain had emboldened Hitler and Mussolini to believe the democracies would never fight. Franco's victory confirmed the dictator's belief that the democracies were impotent, and that belief now drove Hitler toward the most aggressive phase of his expansion. The final failures: Austria and Czechoslovakia, 1938–1939. Austria was Hitler's homeland. He had been born there, grown up there, absorbed his rabid German nationalism there. From the moment he took power in Germany, Hitler dreamed of uniting Austria with the Reich, the Anschluss, the joining together of all German-speaking peoples. But Austria was theoretically protected. The Treaty of Versailles explicitly forbade Austria from uniting with Germany. The Stresa Front of 1935 had committed Britain, France, and Italy to defending Austrian independence. Austria had treaties with both Italy and France guaranteeing its sovereignty. Those guarantees proved worthless. In February 1938, Hitler summoned Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg to the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat. For 3 hours, Hitler harangued Schuschnigg, threatening invasion if Austria didn't accept Nazi demands. Legalize the Austrian Nazi Party, appoint Nazis to key cabinet positions, coordinate foreign policy with Germany. Schuschnigg, bullied and intimidated, agreed. But when Schuschnigg returned to Vienna, he made one last gamble. He scheduled a referendum for March 13th. Should Austria remain independent? The vote would be yes or no, nothing about uniting with Germany. Hitler was furious. He couldn't risk Austrian voters choosing independence. On March 11th, he ordered the Wehrmacht to prepare for invasion. That evening, Hitler delivered an ultimatum: cancel the referendum and resign, or face invasion. Schuschnigg desperately called Mussolini, hoping Il Duce would honor Italy's commitment to defend Austria. Mussolini's response: Italy would do nothing. France was between governments and couldn't respond. Britain issued a tepid protest. Schuschnigg resigned. On March 12th, German troops crossed the border into Austria. There was no resistance. Austrian Nazis had already seized key positions. In many towns, German soldiers were greeted with flowers and cheering crowds. The Austrian military was ordered not to resist. Hitler himself crossed into his homeland, visiting his childhood home in Braunau am Inn. In Vienna, he stood on the balcony of the Hofburg Palace and declared Austria's incorporation into the Greater German Reich. A subsequent plebiscite, rigged, conducted under Nazi intimidation, claimed 99.7% support for the Anschluss. A sovereign nation had been swallowed whole, without a shot fired, without Britain or France moving a single soldier. The Treaty of Versailles, the Stresa Front, Austria's sovereignty treaties, all revealed as worthless paper. But Hitler had gained more than just Austria. He had gained its gold reserves, its industrial capacity, and crucially, its strategic position. Germany now surrounded Czechoslovakia on 3 sides, and in Czechoslovakia lived 3 million Germans who would become Hitler's next target. The Sudetenland, the mountainous rim of Czechoslovakia bordering Germany and Austria, was home to about 3 million ethnic Germans. They had been part of the Austrian Empire before 1918, had never wanted to be in Czechoslovakia, and now found themselves a minority in a Slavic state. Hitler encouraged the Sudeten German Party, led by Konrad Henlein, to make increasingly radical demands for autonomy. This was the ticking time bomb planted at Versailles in 1919. Sudeten Germans were genuinely discriminated against by the Czech majority. Their complaints weren't entirely fabricated. But Hitler didn't care about their legitimate grievances. He wanted a crisis he could exploit to justify expansion. By May 1938, the crisis was escalating. Hitler massed troops on the Czech border. Czechoslovakia, unlike Austria, had a serious military. The Czech army numbered 35 divisions with modern equipment. The border fortifications in the Sudetenland were formidable. Czechoslovakia had mutual defense treaties with France and the Soviet Union. On paper, Czechoslovakia could fight. More importantly, Czechoslovakia would fight. President Edvard Beneš declared that Czechoslovakia would defend every inch of its territory. The Czechs mobilized their army. The French reaffirmed their treaty obligations. For a moment, it seemed like Hitler had overreached. War appeared imminent. Hitler backed down. In May 1938, he wasn't quite ready for general war. Germany was rearming but not fully prepared. But the crisis revealed something. Britain and France would do almost anything to avoid war. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain began working on a solution that would give Hitler what he wanted while avoiding conflict. Throughout summer 1938, tensions escalated. Hitler demanded that Czechoslovakia cede the Sudetenland to Germany. Beneš refused. Surrendering the Sudetenland meant giving up Czechoslovakia's border fortifications and industrial base. Without them, Czechoslovakia couldn't defend itself. In September, as war seemed imminent, Chamberlain took an extraordinary step. Without consulting the Czechs, he flew to Germany to meet Hitler personally. It was the first time a British Prime Minister had flown anywhere on official business. Chamberlain, 69 years old, had never flown before. Chamberlain met Hitler on September 15th at Berchtesgaden. Hitler ranted for 3 hours about Czech oppression of Germans. Chamberlain, to Hitler's surprise, essentially agreed to German annexation of the Sudetenland if it could be arranged peacefully. He flew back to Britain to consult his cabinet and the French. Chamberlain then presented Czechoslovakia with an ultimatum: accept the transfer of the Sudetenland to Germany, or Britain and France would abandon Czechoslovakia to its fate. The Czechs, stunned and betrayed, had no choice. If they fought alone, they would lose. But Hitler wasn't done. When Chamberlain returned to Germany on September 22nd, Hitler increased his demands. He wanted immediate military occupation of the Sudetenland. No gradual transfer, no plebiscite. Chamberlain was shocked but still desperate to avoid war. When Czechoslovakia and France balked, Hitler scheduled the invasion for October 1st. War seemed unavoidable. Britain and France began mobilizing. Czech forces manned their fortifications. Then Mussolini proposed a 4-power conference. Britain, France, Germany, and Italy would decide Czechoslovakia's fate. Conspicuously absent, Czechoslovakia itself. On September 29th, Chamberlain, French Premier Édouard Daladier, Hitler, and Mussolini met in Munich. In less than 24 hours, they agreed. Germany would occupy the Sudetenland in stages beginning October 1st. Czechoslovakia would surrender all fortifications and border territories. Chamberlain and Daladier presented this to the Czechs as a fait accompli: accept or fight alone. Beneš, betrayed by his allies, accepted. We have been abandoned, he told his people. He resigned in October and fled to exile. Chamberlain flew back to London waving the piece of paper he and Hitler had signed, a declaration that Britain and Germany would resolve future disputes through negotiation. At the airport, he famously declared, "I believe it is peace for our time." In Parliament, Chamberlain defended Munich as the only alternative to war. Most MPs agreed. The British public, terrified by visions of London under aerial bombardment, supported appeasement. Only a few voices, notably Winston Churchill, warned that Britain had chosen dishonor and would get war anyway. "You were given the choice between war and dishonor," Churchill told Parliament. "You chose dishonor, and you will have war." Munich didn't satisfy Hitler. It whetted his appetite. The Sudetenland was nice, but why stop there? Slovakia, the eastern part of Czechoslovakia, was ethnically distinct from the Czechs and had separatist movements. Hitler encouraged Slovak nationalists to demand independence, creating internal chaos in what remained of Czechoslovakia. On March 14, 1939, Slovakia declared independence under German protection, meaning it became a German puppet state. That same day, Hitler summoned Czech President Emil Hácha to Berlin. Hácha, 66 years old and in poor health, was subjected to hours of bullying by Hitler and Göring, who threatened to bomb Prague into rubble unless Hácha signed a document placing Czechoslovakia under German protection. Hácha suffered a heart attack during the meeting. Hitler's doctor revived him with injections. At 4 a.m., Hácha signed. Hours later, German troops rolled into Prague. Unlike Austria, this was a clear-cut conquest of non-German territory. Hitler had violated the Munich Agreement he'd signed just 6 months earlier. Czechoslovakia ceased to exist. The Czech lands became the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, a German colony in all but name. Czechs were to be Germanized or deported. Slovak puppet state gave Hitler a launching point for future expansion eastward. Britain and France protested, but their protests rang hollow. Chamberlain lamely suggested that Slovakia's independence meant the Munich Agreement no longer applied, so technically Hitler hadn't violated it. No one believed this transparent excuse. But the conquest of Czechoslovakia did finally accomplish something. It shattered the illusion that Hitler wanted only to unite German-speaking peoples. He had just conquered 7 million Czechs who spoke a Slavic language and had no interest in being part of Germany. The next day, Chamberlain told his cabinet that he could no longer trust Hitler's word. A bit late to realize that. With Czechoslovakia gone, Poland stood exposed. Hitler's next demand was obvious to anyone paying attention. Danzig, the German-speaking free city on Poland's Baltic coast, must return to Germany. The Polish corridor, the strip of formerly German territory that gave Poland sea access, must be surrendered. East Prussia must be reconnected to the Reich. Poland, unlike Austria or Czechoslovakia, was prepared to fight. Poland had a large army, a population of 35 million, and a proud military tradition. More importantly, Poland had no illusions about German intentions. Surrendering Danzig would just be the first demand. Better to fight from the start. In late March 1939, Britain and France finally drew a line. They guaranteed Poland's independence. If Germany attacked Poland, Britain and France would declare war. Chamberlain announced this to Parliament on March 31st. Similar guarantees were extended to Romania and Greece. It was a dramatic reversal. For years, Britain had avoided commitments in Eastern Europe. Now Chamberlain was guaranteeing Poland's borders, something Britain lacked the military means to actually defend. It was a guarantee based on deterrence, on the hope that Hitler would back down if he knew war with Britain and France was certain. But Hitler didn't back down from threats. He responded to strength, and Britain's guarantee to Poland, while morally admirable, revealed military weakness. Britain had no way to actually help Poland if Germany attacked. The guarantee was supposed to deter war. Instead, it ensured that when Hitler invaded Poland, and everyone now knew he would, it would trigger general war. The final opportunity to stop Hitler without war had passed. Each previous failure, Manchuria, Ethiopia, the Rhineland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, had emboldened him for the next. Now he believed Britain and France were bluffing. They would protest, they would threaten, but they wouldn't actually fight. He had seen this pattern too many times. Hitler was half right. Britain and France would fight, but they would fight unprepared, without a plan to actually help Poland, and without the ally who might have made the difference, the Soviet Union. The final betrayal, the Nazi-Soviet pact. Joseph Stalin watched Hitler's expansion with growing alarm. The Soviet Union shared borders with German-occupied Czechoslovakia and with Poland. If Hitler continued eastward, and Mein Kampf made clear that was exactly his intention, the Soviet Union would be Hitler's ultimate target. Stalin wanted collective security against Hitler. In April 1939, he proposed a military alliance with Britain and France. The three powers would jointly guarantee Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states against German aggression. If Hitler attacked any of them, all three would respond. It made strategic sense. Hitler was the common threat. An alliance of the Western democracies and the Soviet Union would present such overwhelming force that Hitler might actually be deterred. At minimum, it would make a German invasion of Poland suicidal. But Britain and France distrusted Stalin almost as much as they feared Hitler. Stalin had purged his officer corps in 1937–38, executing tens of thousands of military commanders based on paranoid suspicion. His regime had deliberately starved millions of Ukrainians. The communist ideology he represented seemed, to many Western conservatives, as dangerous as Nazism. Moreover, Poland refused to allow Soviet troops on Polish territory, even to defend Poland from Germany. Poland remembered the 1920 Soviet invasion during the Russian Civil War. They trusted Stalin about as much as they trusted Hitler, which is to say, not at all. Negotiations between Britain, France, and the Soviet Union dragged through summer 1939. The British and French sent low-level military delegations by slow ship rather than flying senior officials. The message was clear: they weren't serious about an alliance. Stalin drew the obvious conclusion. Britain and France hoped Germany and the Soviet Union would destroy each other, and the Western democracies would sit back and wait for both to exhaust themselves. They had betrayed Czechoslovakia to Hitler. They would probably betray Poland too. Why should Stalin trust them to honor commitments to defend the Soviet Union? While pretending to negotiate with Britain and France, Stalin secretly opened talks with Germany. It was a stunning reversal. Nazi Germany and Communist Russia were supposed to be ideological enemies. Hitler ranted constantly about the Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy. Stalin purged anyone suspected of Nazi sympathies. The two regimes represented utterly opposed worldviews, but they shared one interest: carving up Poland. On August 23, 1939, the world awoke to shocking news. Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the foreign ministers who signed it, guaranteed that neither country would attack the other. If one became involved in war, the other would remain neutral. The public pact was shocking enough, but it included secret protocols that wouldn't be revealed until after World War II. Poland would be divided between Germany and the Soviet Union along the Narel-Vistula-San rivers. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, fell within the Soviet sphere of influence. Finland and Bessarabia, part of Romania, were also assigned to the Soviet sphere. Hitler and Stalin had agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. The pact gave Hitler a free hand to attack Poland without fear of Soviet intervention. It gave Stalin breathing room to build up Soviet forces before the inevitable conflict with Germany. Both dictators understood the pact was temporary, but both thought they could use it to their advantage. For the Western powers, the Nazi-Soviet pact was a catastrophic failure of diplomacy. They had pushed Stalin into Hitler's arms through months of half-hearted negotiations and obvious distrust. Now Hitler could attack Poland without facing a two-front war. The one thing that might have deterred Hitler, the threat of fighting Germany's traditional nightmare, simultaneous wars in the West and East, was gone. With the Soviet threat neutralized, Hitler set his final plans in motion. Operation Fall Weiss, Case White, the invasion of Poland, was scheduled for dawn on September 1st. But Hitler hoped even now that Britain and France might back down. They had betrayed Czechoslovakia. Why not Poland? He demanded that Poland surrender Danzig and the Polish corridor. Poland refused. On August 25th, Britain and Poland signed a formal treaty of alliance, reaffirming Britain's commitment to defend Poland. Hitler hesitated, postponing the invasion by 5 days. Mussolini, sensing disaster, told Hitler that Italy wasn't ready for general war and would remain neutral. Hitler was furious, but proceeded anyway. He convinced himself that once Germany destroyed Poland quickly, Britain and France would seek peace rather than continue a war they couldn't win. On August 31st, as a last propaganda move, the SS staged a fake Polish attack on a German radio station at Gleiwitz. German officers dressed in Polish uniforms attacked the station, broadcast anti-German messages, and left behind the bodies of concentration camp prisoners dressed as Polish soldiers. It was a transparent false flag operation, but it gave Hitler his excuse. In a speech to the Reichstag on September 1st, Hitler declared, "Last night, for the first time, regular Polish soldiers fired on our territory. Since 5:45 a.m. we have been returning fire." The lie didn't matter. Nothing would have stopped Hitler now. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, 1939, without a declaration of war, German forces crossed the Polish border. The Luftwaffe bombed Polish airfields. German battleships shelled Polish coastal fortifications. 1.5 million German troops surged into Poland from 3 directions. World War II had begun. The failure of a generation. For 2 days, Britain and France dithered. They had guaranteed Poland's independence. But now that the moment had arrived, they hesitated. Perhaps Hitler would still back down? Perhaps last-minute diplomacy could avoid general war. On September 3rd, Britain delivered an ultimatum to Germany. withdraw from Poland or face war. When the deadline passed with no response, Chamberlain addressed the nation by radio. "This country is at war with Germany." France declared war a few hours later. But Britain and France had no plan to actually help Poland. No offensive action in the west to force Germany to divert troops. No airstrikes on German cities. No movement whatsoever. The British Expeditionary Force slowly deployed to France over the following months. The French army sat behind the Maginot Line waiting. This became known as the Phony War, or Sitzkrieg, a war where the combatants declared war but didn't fight. While Britain and France did nothing, Poland died. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg tactics, fast-moving armored columns supported by dive bombers, shredded Polish defenses. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, fulfilling its secret agreement with Hitler. Warsaw fell on September 27th after heroic resistance. By October 6th, Poland ceased to exist, partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union for the fourth time in history. Polish casualties, about 70,000 dead, 133,000 wounded, 690,000 captured. German casualties, 16,000 dead, 32,000 wounded. Britain and France had declared war but had done nothing to save the country they'd guaranteed. The pattern of appeasement, grand declarations followed by inaction, continued even after war began. The interconnected failures. How appeasement built the war. World War II wasn't inevitable. At multiple points between 1931 and 1939, determined action by the international community could have stopped the slide toward catastrophe. But at each critical moment, the world chose inaction, half measures, and appeasement. Let's trace the interconnected pattern of Manchuria, 1931, showed that the League of Nations had no enforcement mechanism. Japan seized Chinese territory, walked out of the League, and faced no consequences. Lesson learned. Aggression works if you're determined enough. Hitler's rearmament, 1933 to 1935, violated the Treaty of Versailles openly. Britain and France protested but did nothing to stop it. Lesson learned. Treaty violations go unpunished. Ethiopia, 1935 to 1936, proved the League was worthless. Italy used chemical weapons to conquer a member state, and the League's sanctions were weak and unenforced. Lesson learned. Even clear-cut aggression won't trigger collective security. Rhineland, 1936, showed Hitler that France wouldn't defend even its own treaty-guaranteed security zone. Germany was still weak enough to be crushed, but France didn't act. Lesson learned. The democracies won't fight to enforce their own treaties. Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, demonstrated that Britain and France would let fascism win rather than risk confrontation. Their non-intervention was a farce that abandoned democracy. Lesson learned. The democracies are cowardly and divided. Austria, 1938, showed that treaty guarantees were worthless paper. A sovereign nation was annexed without resistance. Lesson learned. Hitler can redraw the map of Europe without consequences. Munich, 1938, proved democracies would betray their allies to avoid war. Czechoslovakia had a defensible position and mutual defense treaties, but Britain and France forced it to surrender. Lesson learned. Alliances with democracies are worthless. Appeasement has no limit. Prague, 1939, revealed that Hitler wouldn't be satisfied with uniting ethnic Germans. He wanted empire. But even this didn't trigger military response. Lesson learned. Even blatant conquest draws only protests. Each failure emboldened the next aggression. Each act of appeasement convinced Hitler, Mussolini, and Japan's militarists that the democracies would never fight. And they were almost right. The democracies only fought when they had no other choice, after the fascist powers had grown so strong that the war became far more costly than it needed to be. The lesson history refuses to learn. The 20 years between the world wars teach an uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't emerge fully formed. It builds step by step, testing boundaries, probing for weakness. It doesn't announce itself with clarity. Hitler told the world his plans in Mein Kampf, but people chose not to believe him. Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, but people told themselves it was just an old-fashioned colonial war. Nothing to worry about. Japan seized Manchuria, but it was so far away, someone else's problem. At each stage, stopping the aggressors would have been relatively easy. In 1931, economic sanctions could have forced Japan out of Manchuria. In 1935, oil sanctions would have crippled Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. In 1936, a French military response to the Rhineland remilitarization would have sent German forces retreating in humiliation. Hitler himself admitted this. In 1938, supporting Czechoslovakia would have confronted Hitler with a serious military challenge he might have lost. But stopping aggression requires will. It requires accepting short-term costs to prevent long-term catastrophe. It requires leaders willing to tell their populations that peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of justice, defended by force when necessary. The democracies lacked that will. Traumatized by World War I, economically devastated by the Great Depression, politically divided, they chose hope over action. They hoped Hitler would be satisfied. They hoped Mussolini could be appeased. They hoped Japan would stop on its own. They hoped that if they just didn't provoke the aggressors would leave them alone. Hope isn't a strategy. And wishful thinking isn't diplomacy. The final accounting is devastating. Because the democracies refused to stop aggression early, they faced a far more terrible war later. The Spanish Civil War killed 500,000 people. World War II killed 60 million. In 1936, stopping Hitler would have required perhaps 100,000 troops marching into the Rhineland. By 1939, it required 110,000 British and American deaths plus 340,000 Soviet deaths plus millions more among other Allied nations. Czechoslovakia's border fortifications, surrendered at Munich, would have cost Germany perhaps 100,000 casualties to overcome. Without them, German armies rolled through Eastern Europe almost unopposed until they reached the Soviet Union. The Holocaust, which killed 6 million Jews plus millions of others, wouldn't have been possible if Hitler had been stopped in the 1930s. The industrial murder machine required years of Nazi control to build. Every year of appeasement gave Hitler more time to consolidate power, more resources to build death camps, more territory in which to carry out genocide. As German tanks rolled across the Polish border that September morning, they crushed more than just Polish forces. They crushed the illusion that civilization would protect itself through reason, law, and negotiation. They vindicated every skeptic who doubted that international organizations could keep peace. They proved that power in the end flows from the barrel of a gun, and those unwilling to use force will be conquered by those who are. The League of Nations, that noble experiment in collective security, revealed itself as an elaborate pretense. The Treaty of Versailles, meant to ensure never again, had instead planted the seeds of a far more terrible conflict. The democracies, having sacrificed millions to defeat Germany in World War I, had, through weakness, allowed Germany to rise again stronger and more aggressive than before. World War II was built through 1,000 failures, 1,000 moments when leaders chose the easy path over the right one, when they chose their political careers over their nation's futures, when they convinced themselves that surely this time the dictator would be satisfied. September 1, 1939 was the day those choices came due. The bill was 60 million lives. The currency was blood. And the lesson, written in the ruins of cities, the ashes of concentration camps, the graves of a generation, was stark. Appeasement doesn't prevent war. It just ensures you'll fight it later, from a weaker position at a higher cost. Yes, at dozens of points, Manchuria, Ethiopia, the Rhineland, Spain, Austria, the Sudetenland, Prague. Each was a fork in the road where the right choice, the difficult choice, could have prevented or limited the catastrophe that followed. But the tragic reality is that preventing war requires the will to risk war. The democracies, terrified of another World War I, chose peace at any price. They didn't understand that peace has a price too, and sometimes that price is standing up to bullies before they become too strong to stop. The world learned this lesson between 1939 and 1945, paid for in blood and fire. The post-war generation built new institutions, NATO, the United Nations, the European Union, designed specifically to avoid the failures of the 1930s. They understood that collective security requires collective will, backed by force. But memory fades. Each generation must relearn the lesson. Freedom and peace aren't the natural state of things. They're achievements that must be defended. And defending them sometimes requires more than words. The 20 years that led to World War II built a catastrophe through inaction, through false hopes, through leaders who mistook appeasement for wisdom. They show us that the road to hell is paved not just with good intentions, but with the failure to act on them. In the pre-dawn of September 1st, 1939, as German soldiers peered into the darkness before the invasion, the world's failure was complete. The consequences would echo for decades. And the lesson, bought at unimaginable cost, remains. Evil, unopposed, doesn't reform. It expands. The time to stop it is at the beginning, when stopping it is hard but possible. Wait until stopping it is necessary, and you may find it impossible. World War II was the price humanity paid for refusing to learn that lesson in time.